Welcome to chapter 2. To me, this is my favorite chapter of the book, and I hope that you will feel the same as we get into it. I really, as much as I appreciate the theories of social welfare policy and discussing some of the underlying values and beliefs and that sort of thing. I really am find it refreshing just to learn the history of social welfare in America, and so that's what this chapter is all about. Really straightforward stuff. So let's get right into it. I'm going to hope to do this presentation a little bit faster than my last one. I hope to keep these to about 10 minutes. So here we go. The historical foundations of social welfare in America. We're going to start with the colonial period. That's 1600s to 1800s. So it's interesting as we learn this history, how perspectives on social welfare and policy, our views on the poor, really change with what's happening economically in the land, what's happening politically in the land, et cetera. So in the colonial period, we're a little more spread out. There's not, there's America is just seen as this giant wide open land of abundant resources. We are very much in a period where the native people and African slaves are not considered persons. They're without rights, so they don't even factor into the thinking of the time. There's the perspective is there's plenty of room for growth and personal gain if you're willing to work, and anyone in poverty is seen as a failure. That's their own misfortune, and not any responsibility is put on society here during this time. But then we find, and really the foundations of social welfare itself, and of course policy as well, really dates back to England, and we have what are called the Elizabethan Poor Laws. In 1601, the first public social welfare policy was drafted in England. There's a link to a video about that if you'd like to check it out, get some more detail. In this time, they really divided out categories of need. There were the worthy and the unworthy. This is a pretty straightforward concept, I think, and really has its roots in the Bible, where in the Bible, it's there's passages that talk about seeing about widows and orphans and their distress, and the elderly, and then the unworthy poor. These are able-bodied singles, who in the mind of the times should be working and should be providing for themselves. And of course, the unmarried woman is someone in those days that was shunned, really. And even some of these things, especially the able-bodied man that is poor, is there are some biblical scriptures that sort of back up the concept of you don't work, you don't eat kind of perspective there. Some of these laws really created the structure that still exists today. There's an order that is laid out there. Support for someone who needs it needs to come from the family first, and then the local community. That also has its roots in biblical text. The concept of a person in need needs to be a part of the community. Someone just wanders into town, you don't know who they are. There's a lot of suspicion around that. The laws did not protect the stranger. There was this underlying belief that if you wanted to work, if you were willing to work, you could work. So let's shift to America. Social welfare in colonial America. Well, in the South, this concept that was transferring over to America from England, of course, did not apply to a giant swath of the population. Slaves, of course, were not looked on as even people. So they, their care was the responsibility of their owners, and obviously there was no accountability there. The North has its own sort of dark history. While there was less of the sort of that slave tradition, you look at the treatment of the native people there. They were not treated like humans with rights, and their land was up for the taking. So again, this idea that poverty is a social misfortune. Then we kind of shift into what's called the pre-Civil War period. We're shifting now from an agrarian society where we're kind of spread out and taking care of ourselves to a more industrial scene. And then things really start to change. Immigrants start flooding into the US and settling in big cities. All of a sudden, social welfare sort of becomes a necessary thing. And of course, as it sort of seems to, the religious of the day have a moral set of rules that lean towards thinking about the poor. So we start to see the openings of mental institutions, orphanages, places for disabled people, and however, generally speaking, poverty was still just put in the category of the fault of the person who was poor. So then we have the Civil War. The Civil War does mark a pretty big shift in the way we think about social welfare policy, and it gets us. I feel like it hits fast forward on our progress here, but of course leaves us after some really important sort of moments in history. Kind of drops off again. So here we go. For the first time, the federal government provided benefits, and they did this in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau. This was post Civil War, and this is sort of how they legislated what to do with freed slaves, and there were some benefits. Now, those benefits, it was a pretty short window in time. Let me see if I have it here. It sounded really good. There were some programs to protect the freed slave, and aid given, and but that window snapped shut pretty quickly. Let me see. I had it here, but anyway, yeah. From it was less than 10 years, 1865 to 1872 was a window in time where there were benefits for these freed slaves, but then boom, they shut it. That time was over, and by then everybody had to compete for themselves. And it's interesting to see. Here's a quote from the book that I thought was interesting. What institutional slavery accomplished before the Civil War, social values and structural systems maintained after the Civil War. So what we found was some slaves left somewhat stable living environments, and then were just cast out on their own and into abject poverty. And some found themselves not other than freedom, not much better off than they were before because of the systems that were still in place. But this did start the thinking that there could be outside factors that could create poverty, and that maybe a social response should be appropriate. So then we're into the progressive era. the U.S. really starts to catch economically, industrial expansion, urban areas are growing, and with that, poverty is growing. It's an ugly shift from agrarian to industrial society. We don't know what to do with a giant city. That's something that is sort of new in America. And we start to now think about national involvement in social welfare. Now the roots of social work sort of begin in this era, and we call this the progressive era. There are two categories of social welfare organizations now. Some are called charity organization societies. They really sort of took on a belief that poverty was rooted in character deficiencies of the poor, and so they would go house to house and try to stop poverty by training people to recognize their flaws and work their way out of it. So definitely takes on sort of a responsibility mindset. The idea of casework is where it came out of this group in this time. They focused on children, and then finding work for folks who are able to work and training them to do it. So I think there's some really good things about the charity organization societies. I am really inspired by the settlement movement. This was sort of the other side of the coin. These were social workers, and who decided, no, it's more than that. There's more to poverty than just sort of visiting house to house and teaching someone who's poor. The social workers in this movement decided they would settle in poor communities, living amongst the poor, and from that place, real work could be done. So this is where the idea of a community center begins. They would a settlement social worker had a lot more skin in the game. They lived in the community where they worked, and in that way, the needs of the community were their needs, and so more political activism began. Social welfare policy really came out of this side of the progressive era. And some of the names that pop out are like Jane Addams, and she was a pioneer of that era. Some of the things that sort of the big changes in this era, the women's suffrage movement, but then we see ugly things. Plessy versus Ferguson, racism was still just had a stranglehold on the overall national mindset. Women got the right to vote in 1920, 100 years ago. Then we find sort of what I feel like is the hinge of social welfare development in the U.S. It was still easy in those days for the general populace to blame poverty on personal misfortune or lack of responsibility. Racism still sort of segregated off the portion of society that was that there wasn't a lot of concern still about African Americans, and but the Great Depression changed the narrative. The Great Depression affected everyone. It wasn't just a small number of poor people. It was now this event woke up the rest of the populace to say sometimes poverty is bigger than your personal choices. So federal involvement really starts in this era. Yeah, we see when nationwide poverty sets in, the existing systems were just not enough. Public opinion starts to change, and then we have the entering in of the New Deal, which is the federal government's response to these conditions. All these acts sort of start to take the scene. 1935 is a compromise piece of legislation that created social insurance and public assistance. Basically, the birth of kind of more modern day social welfare policy. Started state-run programs for the aged, dependent children, unemployed, vocational rehab, infant and maternal health. Social insurance. So social welfare policy in these days divided up into two things: social insurance, which was something you paid into workers over a lifetime, so that they would be able to retire, or if disability hit. As long as you paid into that system, you could benefit from it. It was guaranteed for the rest of your life. Public assistance was a different thing. It was intended as a government assistance for those who fall below the poverty line. It was public, so it was a government system, and it was supposed to be a temporary way to help people in distress. This shows the beginnings of a compassionate view of the poor. So then we kind of head into the post-war economy and we start to recover. Then we see another really important moment in policy. The GI Bill is recognized. So veterans who have served in wars are now getting some sort of benefits. Another sort of moment in policy that is pretty well known is the War on Poverty. This is in the 1960s. We get some of these organizations that, man, they have withheld the test of time, and we really start to think differently together. The Civil Rights Act is put into place. Medicare, Medicaid, all these things, and so it's sort of a more liberal time as we think about social welfare and policy. And then we kind of go into a time of conservatism, economic growth in the country. And it seems like this is what happens. As economic growth happens, and there's a general level of raising economic situation, the ideas change, and the national consciousness changes, where someone who is poor, it changes to be more their fault in the eyes of the people. So, but that being said, more rights are fought for. Groups are getting a voice. Women's groups are getting a voice that they never had, and some of that really is catching fire. Then we have the 1990s and the American Disability Act, Civil Rights Restoration Act, lots and lots more social welfare policies sort of putting in place. That being said, there's a back and forth. We had a real conservative time with culminating with like Reagan, and then in the 1990s, we have Bill Clinton, who's an interesting character in the story of social welfare policy, where he really took the classic welfare systems and limited them. For a Democrat, he actually took some conservative stances, limiting welfare to a temporary time period. And we're getting into more modern times. So where social welfare policy is a much more common thing, and the book gets into a little more modern issues, prescription drug benefits and that sort of thing. Really, really fascinated with the history that gets us to a sort of modern moment. So there you have it. I don't know how long that was. I hope that was shorter than my last one. I doubt it, though. We're going to end here with a couple of discussion questions that are posted in your module. But I would like you to, as you read this, consider these two questions. I want you to highlight a period that we've talked about. And for each period, find one period of history where individualism seemed very strong, where responsibility, maybe economic prosperity was up, and what were the social welfare responses in times like those, and then compare that to a period in history in which social responsibility seemed strong. What were the identifiers there? What social responses of that time reflected those beliefs? So thank you for listening, and We will see you next week.